Welcome to Morningstar. Today I talk to our equity analyst Johann Scholtz about the European banking sector and the earnings season that we have just completed. Welcome, Johann. Can you please take us through some recent developments we have seen in the earnings season?
Thank you very much, Robert. Yes, I think what we've seen overall is that revenue growth is still kind of anemic, but relatively solid for most of the banks. And for the banks, we typically separate revenue into two main components, which would be revenue that banks get from interest, net interest income, and then also revenue that banks get from non-interest revenue, which the bulk is fee income, but there's also a bit of a trading portion, and for some of the banks there's an insurance portion as well. Now if we drill down into the different components of revenue, on the interest income side, we're still seeing a bit of pressure coming through on net interest margins. And that's really a function of the fact that we are experiencing negative interest rates in Europe at the moment. And in effect, banks aren't really earning any money on their deposits. And that's quite an important point for us here at Morningstar. One of the most important moats that we identify for banks is banks that we like, banks that's got access to retail deposits, cheap retail deposits, that's also quite sticky. But now in an environment where interest rates are low, you're not really seeing that benefit coming to the fore. So that would be on interest revenue. Moving over maybe to the non-interest revenue portion, fees, it's for most of the banks it's actually been quite strong, and that's a function of banks moving quite aggressively into the asset management space. It's a strategic imperative for nearly all of the banks to develop their asset management capability in one form or another. I should, however, say that in the fourth quarter we did see a bit of pressure coming through on fee income, especially from asset management operations, and that was really a function of the market volatility that we saw in the fourth quarter. So you're really seeing assets under management coming down, which then obviously have an impact on fees that's based as a portion of assets under management, and you're also seeing that performance fees. Obviously, the performance of a lot of the asset managers weren't there in the fourth quarter, so performance fees also came down. Trading revenue across the board remains weak. European banks battle to compete against the US investment banks that's really gaining a lot of market share in the investment banking side, which is, well, trading revenue is one of the big components of investment banking. And it's also a function, of stricter capital requirements that came into force after the crisis, really limiting the bank's ability to generate trading revenue. We also feel that the European investment banking landscape is quite fragmented. Most of the European banks still have some kind of investment banking operation. Now, if you contrast that to the US, where you've really got 4 or 5 big investment banks that completely dominate the market. So in the US, much bigger market, 3 or 4 or 5 banks dominating that, but you kind of need to maintain the same cost base to generate the revenue. Now you compare that to Europe, where you've got a much more fragmented market in a smaller market. The competitive dynamics just doesn't add up for European banks in the investment banking space, we feel. Then maybe stepping over to credit losses, which is typically the biggest variable for banking earnings. Now the trend that we've seen basically for some of the banks post the crisis and for some of the other banks post 2011, when there was a bit of pressure in Europe, we've really seen credit losses moderate quite significantly, and that's been a big driver of earnings for the banks. Now the problem that we have with that is that we feel that at the moment credit losses are below what we would view as a through the cycle level or a mid-cycle level. So you know, that starts to raise questions about earnings quality. Is the earnings really of good quality, sustainable earnings that the banks can generate going forward? And yeah, we feel that you know, whilst in the near term credit losses might still come off, at some stage it's going to turn, and that's going to place pressure on banks' earnings. Now, a lot of people would counter that argument by saying that yes, but banks will benefit from higher interest rates at some stage. There might be a slight problem because at the moment we are experiencing a slowdown in the economy, but we haven't really seen inflation picking up yet. So there's no real prospect of earnings, interest rate increases coming through in the next year, 18 months. So you might actually end up with a situation where you start seeing credit losses ticking up, but you don't get the benefit of higher interest income coming through.
Looking at the landscape, you have two top picks. First to start with is Santander. Why are they one of your two top picks?
Well, we like Santander. We've got a narrow moat rating on Santander, and that's really based on we believe it as a cost advantage due to its access to cheap funding. And then we also believe that Santander benefits from switching costs. It's difficult for clients to switch from Santander to another bank. Now, Santander is actually quite as a conglomerate, and strangely enough, nearly 40% of its earnings comes from Brazil. So it kind of stands separate to the rest of the European banks in that quite a substantial portion of its earnings actually comes outside of Europe. And you know, I think in Brazil it's got a very strong competitive advantage. It generates return on equity north of 20%, or close to 20% in its Brazilian operations. Brazil is, whilst it's quite a volatile market with a bit of political uncertainty, it's actually been a very profitable banking market over the years. It's quite a concentrated banking market with 3 or 4 big players dominating banking in Brazil. So we like the Brazilian portion of Santander. Then in Spain, it's got a good franchise. It suffers from some of the issues that we talked to earlier. That's European banks are faced with, but we do believe that the Spanish banking market is also becoming more concentrated. There's been a push from regulators to for mergers and to establish a more concentrated banking market, which typically tends to support profitability. And I think once again, I don't think we're really seeing the full benefit of that yet coming through in a low interest rate environment.
The second topic that you have is that on top of your list is Credit Suisse. What about them?
We really like Credit Suisse. You know, we kind of view it as the poor man's UBS. Now, UBS is probably one of the most profitable banks in Europe at the moment. UBS, which was really one of the poster childs for the 2008 crisis, where they had excessive leverage, excessive exposure to trading. They've really done a brilliant job in turning the business around and focusing the business very much on wealth and asset management. Now, Credit Suisse is pretty much going through a similar process, but they're just not as far down the line as UBS in terms of transforming its business. And we feel that the market is possibly not fully appreciating how Credit Suisse would look like once this process is over and done with. At the moment, its financials is a bit messy. There's a lot of non-recurring charges coming through, which I think obscures the true profitability of the Credit Suisse franchise. And while we like wealth and asset management, it's typically an area where we find a lot of moats. And especially for Credit Suisse, we feel it benefits because its target market is really ultra high net worth individuals, so really wealthy people. So we've got Credit Suisse also on a narrow mode due to switching costs and the intangible asset that sits in the brand.
Okay, very clear. Johann, thank you very much for this overview of the European banking landscape.